I wasn't in a good place that fall, and if you had driven past the Sutton place at first light, you would have seen a man who looked steady from the road and hollow up close. I was 42, born on that ground, and practical to the point of irritation according to my wife, Mara, who used to say I trusted a post-hole digger more than my own feelings. She died in March from an aneurysm that gave us no warning and no goodbyes, just one ordinary Tuesday that split in half around noon. By October, I could still run the place, still keep calves tagged and hay dry and invoices paid, but the centre of me had gone quiet in a way I couldn't work around. I knew what every board on that farm needed. I had no idea what I needed. The homestead sat where the creek flattened and bent west, with cottonwoods along the lower ground and cedar up the slope where the wind hit hardest in winter. At dawn, the fog stayed low in the bottom, like breath trapped under a blanket, and frost edged the wire in white stitches that glittered until the sun got high enough to undo them. Cattle made those low, patient sounds in the dark before feeding, and the barn tin ticked as it warmed. It was beautiful in the way working places get beautiful when nobody is trying to make them look that way. It also felt like a church after everyone had gone home. The shape of life was still there. The voice was gone. Mara's handwriting was all over the place, and that turned out to be harder than any empty room. She labelled feed bins in black marker on masking tape, neat block letters that leaned a little right. She wrote carving notes in the ledger on the mudroom counter, then underlined dates twice when she wanted to make sure I saw them. She tied red cloth strips to the gates that tended to stick so she could spot them from the truck at dusk. Months after she was gone, I would reach for that ledger and see her last page, the one where she had written, "North pasture hinge squeals again," with a little frowning face beside it, and I'd stand there with my hand on the cover until the coffee went cold. People tell you grief comes in waves. Mine came in ordinary objects. My routine got tight and mean because it was the only way to get through a day without unraveling. I got up at 4:30, no alarm most mornings. Wood stove first, coffee second, boots, jacket, cap, flashlight, feed room, barn, south gate, then back across the yard before sunup to check water lines. I fixed what was broke. I wrote what was spent. I answered only the calls I had to. Supper was usually eggs or canned chili eaten standing at the counter because sitting down made the silence bigger. By 7:30, I was washed up and looking at the same chair where Mara used to knit and ask me about weights on the steers. By 8, I was in bed with the radio low, not listening to words, just filling the house with a human sound that wasn't mine. My son, Luke, called every few days from Spokane where he did diesel work. He was 21 and stubborn in all the familiar places. First ring, I'd freeze. Second ring, I'd stare at Mara's mug on the drying rack like it might tell me what kind of father answered that call without cracking open. Most nights I let it go to voicemail. He would leave messages that started practical and ended soft. "Hey Dad, just checking if that feed order came through. Call me when you can. Love you." I always texted back something short. "Busy. All good. Talk Sunday." And then didn't call Sunday. I told myself I was sparing him the sound of me. Truth was, speaking her name out loud made the loss fresh every time, as if the mind could be surprised by the same blow forever. June never held any of that against me. She was an old border collie with one ear that never stood all the way up, and a white blaze down her nose that had gone grey at the edges. She moved slower than she used to, but she still checked me like a foreman. If I skipped lunch, she stared until I tore off a piece of sandwich. If I sat too long on the porch steps after dark, she leaned her side into my shin and stayed there. Mara had trained her with hand signals and quiet words, and even after so many months, June would still glance toward the kitchen doorway at feeding time, waiting for the second whistle that never came. Dogs are honest about absence. They don't pretend a thing is fine when it isn't. By the second week of October, the weather had that hard glass edge that meant winter was organizing itself out past the ridges. Days stayed bright and sharp. Nights dropped fast, and the wind shifted northeast more often than I liked. I patched what needed patching, stacked what needed stacking, and tried not to think past the next chore. At the co-op, men stood around the heater and traded forecasts in that half-joking way farmers do when numbers start looking ugly. One of them said we might get an early ice front, 3 nights of bad enough cold to split shallow lines. I nodded and bought extra pipe wrap and mineral tubs. I did not join the part where they talked about families and Thanksgiving plans. I loaded sacks, signed the slip, came home before dark. Evenings were the worst. Work gave the day some shape, but once tools were hung and gates latched, time got broad and unforgiving. I tried television once and lasted 12 minutes. I tried reading and kept staring at the same paragraph. What I could do was sit at the mudroom table with the ledger open and pencil in hand, copying numbers from one page to another, just to feel a measure of control. Mara used to tease me for double recording everything. Said if a tornado took out the house, I'd probably run into the yard carrying feed receipts like they were family photos. She wasn't wrong. Paper held still. Paper stayed where you put it. If I could put the week into lines and columns, maybe it wouldn't spill on me in the dark. One Thursday near dusk, Luke showed up unannounced in his old pickup. Exhaust rattling, tool bag on the passenger seat. I heard the truck before I saw headlights and felt that same tightness in my chest that came with his calls. Only this time there was no button to ignore. He stepped onto the porch, hands deep in his jacket pockets, and for a second he looked about 12, waiting to see what kind of weather he was walking into. "Thought I'd check the heater in the carving shed," he said. "You said it was tripping." "It's fine now," I said. "Reset the breaker yesterday." He nodded once, like he expected that answer and had brought it anyway. "You eaten?" "Yeah." "You lying?" "Little bit." That got a corner of a smile out of him. He came inside, made 2 grilled cheese sandwiches without asking, and we stood at the counter in the old way, shoulder to shoulder, not looking directly at each other much. After a while, he said, "You don't have to do this all by yourself, Dad." I kept my eyes on the skillet. "I know." He let that sit. Then he said, quieter, "Knowing and doing aren't the same thing." We spent an hour in the shed replacing a cracked thermostat wire that didn't need replacing. Then he headed back to town because he had an early shift. At the truck, he put a hand on June's head, then looked at me the way Mara used to when she knew I was deciding whether to close up or step forward. "I'll come Saturday if that works." "Saturday works," I said, and meant it. He nodded, climbed in, and drove out slow over the cattle guard. I stood there until his tail lights dipped behind the cottonwoods. The yard went quiet again, but not as empty as before. The next morning I rose at 4:30 to sleet tapping the kitchen window in little hard bursts. June and I did the first round by lantern because the moon had gone behind cloud and the yard light had burned out sometime in the night. Water tanks looked good. Barn doors held. The cattle were restless but settled once grain hit trough. When I reached the north lane, I saw the old cedar corner post leaning farther than it should from wind we'd had 2 nights earlier, wire sagging low enough that a determined heifer could test it. I stood there in the cold with my gloves tucked under my arms and made the mental list. Jack, staples, new brace. Maybe 2 hours if the ground gave me trouble. In the dark and sleet, it felt like another task on an already overloaded shelf. One more thing waiting for hands that were getting tired of being the only hands. I didn't fix it then. I told myself I'd circle back after daylight and feed. On the walk to the house, I watched June range ahead, paws quiet on wet dirt. And I heard myself mutter that if fences could mend themselves, I might sleep through one full night for the first time in months. It was a dry little joke to nobody. June glanced back at me like she had heard stranger things from humans and could live with this one too. Inside, I stripped off gloves, set coffee to brew, and opened the ledger to a clean page. The stove popped, the sleet thickened against the glass, and the house held that familiar half-light between night chores and morning work. I wrote the date. I wrote north corner leaning, repair after feed. Then I sat there longer than I meant to, pencil in my hand, listening to weather come down on the roof, and wondering how long a man could keep a place running on duty alone before duty gave out. I closed the ledger, set the pencil across the spine, and sat with both hands around my coffee cup until the heat leaked out of it. The stove gave one hard pop and then settled. June lay by the door with her nose on her paws, one eye open on me, waiting for the next move. Outside, sleet kept ticking the windows in uneven bursts, the kind of weather that made every job take longer and every mistake cost more. I put my gloves back on, pulled my cap low, and stepped into that dark hour where the yard looked familiar and strange at the same time. Lantern light reached only as far as the next gate, then got swallowed by wet black pasture. The barn smelled like sweet hay and damp wool, and old wood smoke from my jacket. Cattle shifted in the pens, steam rising off their backs, patient but unsettled by the weather. I moved through chores by habit, grain, latches, a quick hand on a flank here and there, checking for shivers, checking eyes, checking anything that might turn into trouble by noon. The body worked, the mind wandered. At the south trough, I caught myself looking toward the house, toward the mudroom window where Mara used to stand and wave me in when breakfast was ready. And for a second I had that sharp, stupid hope that she might be there anyway, as if grief had just been a long misunderstanding, and someone was about to correct it. The window was dark. I stared too long, then looked down at the floating rim ice and broke it with my boot heel harder than I needed to. I headed north with June at my knee. Wind came across the slope in thin, steady knives, carrying the smell of wet cedar and creek mud. Every post in my flashlight beam threw a long, bent shadow over the sleet-shined ground. There was a point in those mornings where I felt less like a man running a farm, and more like a hinge myself. One small piece holding weight from both directions, never asked if it was cracked, only asked to keep swinging. People call that resilience when they're being kind. Some days it felt closer to plain stubbornness. I stopped at the leaning corner post I'd marked in the ledger. In lantern light, it looked worse than before. Wire belly low between braces, staples lifted on one side, the whole thing pulled diagonal by groundswell and old strain. I set down the lantern and stood there with cold rain needling the back of my neck, mapping the repair in my head. Pull tension, reset post, replace 2 rails, maybe 3. I could do it. I had done harder. I just didn't start. I leaned against the good post beside it and listened to the weather and the distant clink of a halter buckle from the upper paddock. June circled once, came back, and leaned against my boot. Her coat was damp through already, and she looked up at me like she was waiting for direction I wasn't giving. "I know," I said to her. "I know." The words came out rougher than the wind. I cleared my throat and tried again, quieter. "We'll get to it." By the time the eastern ridge turned from charcoal to dull silver, I was still standing there, and that embarrassed me more than I care to admit. I was raised by people who believed you met a hard thing with your hands, not your feelings. But grief doesn't care what kind of family you come from. It takes up room in your chest and taxes every small decision until even a fence post feels like a final exam you didn't study for. I crouched and ran my glove along the bottom wire. It hummed slack. Water beaded and ran. My shoulders ached from yesterday's bale unloading, and there was a deep tiredness under that, the kind sleep doesn't touch. I wanted, for one plain minute, to set the whole morning down and walk back to the house and sit on the mudroom floor until daylight came and went without me. Instead, I straightened, picked up the lantern, and finished rounds because animals don't pause for a man's sorrow. When I came back through the yard, I fed June in the mudroom and ate half a biscuit over the sink. I looked at the clock. 6:42. I should have grabbed tools and gone straight back north. I stood there another minute with my hand on the counter edge, staring at Mara's handwriting on a masking tape label that said, Vet Supplies, in her neat block letters. I told myself this couldn't be real, this way of living beside the shape of somebody and never reaching them. Then I grabbed the fencing pliers, a bundle of staples, post maul, and a fresh brace rail, loaded them in the bed, and drove out. Light came slowly through low cloud, turning the fields the colour of pewter. Sleet had eased into a fine, cold drizzle that slicked everything. The creek bottom held fog like milk in a shallow bowl. Crows sat on the far cottonwoods and did not call. Even the usual morning clatter from starlings in the machine shed eaves was missing. Not silent exactly, but held back, waiting. I parked by the north lane and walked the last stretch to the corner, tools over one shoulder, June trotting ahead, then stopping to check me every few yards. My boots sank a little with each step where the ground had softened. I was rehearsing the work sequence in my head again, trying to settle into the comfort of tasks, when I rounded the last cedar and stopped so hard the maul slid off my shoulder and thudded in mud. The fence was repaired, not patched, repaired. The leaning corner post stood plumb, set deeper than before, tamped tight with clean mineral soil packed around the base. New brace rail square and level, wire stretched firm in tidy, even runs, no kinks, no rushed bends, no chewing marks from bad pliers. The old twine lash I'd thrown in as a temporary hold was gone, replaced with two cedar withes twisted neat and tight where they needed flex. Staples were driven flush, spaced like a careful hand had measured each one. It was better work than I usually managed in sleet. I walked the line once, then again slower, touching each join as if my fingers might explain what my head wouldn't. Posts on that stretch didn't come from my pile by the barn. They were cut cedar, fresh peeled, same diameter, ends sharpened clean with long blade strokes. Whoever put them there had done it in weather. Most folks avoided and had done it quietly enough that neither the dog nor I heard a thing 20 yards away. June sniffed the base of the reset post, sneezed, then wagged so hard her hips swung with it. No raised hackles, no tucked tail, no watchful growl. She moved to the next brace, sniffed once, and sat down like we were inspecting honest work from a neighbour. I said out loud to nobody I could see, "Well, thank you, I guess." It sounded ridiculous the second it left my mouth. I almost laughed at myself, standing in rain thanking empty trees for carpentry. The laugh came out thin, but real. I added, "If you're taking requests, there's a gate hinge by the carving shed that's been squealing since August." That got June's head tilt, and I shook mine at her. "Yeah, I heard it too. I'm talking to weather now." Then I saw the marks. On the top cedar rail, right where a person might brace while pulling tension, there were broad mud prints in a shape too close to a hand to be anything else. Not glove marks. No fabric pattern, no seam lines. Just a palm spread and long fingers, each one thick at the base and narrowing blunt at the tips, pressed deep enough to leave clear edges where mud had been squeezed and dried. I set my own hand beside one and didn't like what that comparison did to my sense of scale. Mine looked like a child's mitten beside a shovel. There were 3 prints on that rail and 1 on the brace post at shoulder height, higher than mine by a full handspan. Below them, in the soft earth, were tracks that matched the weight of those prints, deep, oval, deliberate. Heel, arch, toe spread. 1 set in, 1 set out. No scatter, no confusion, no second person. Whatever had worked this line had moved with purpose. I backed up and scanned the tree line. Cedar trunks, drizzle, fog low in the swale. Nothing moving except a red-tailed hawk lifting out of the far cottonwoods and gliding toward open field. My practical brain went hunting for explanations like it always did. Neighbor boys pulling a prank. Not with work like this. Hired hand? I hadn't hired anyone. Luke, he was in Spokane, and no mechanic I knew carried peeled cedar posts for midnight charity. Could the prints be smudges from bark drag? Could be, until you looked close. 5 clear digits in each, same spread, same pressure points. I knelt and touched one. Cold mud. Real. I spent another 20 minutes trying to disprove what I was seeing, because that felt safer than accepting it. I checked for tire tracks by the lane. None except my own from that morning. I walked the ditch edges for boot prints. Nothing human. I even measured the handprint with my fencing pliers laid tip to handle, then measured again because numbers feel like truth, even when they don't help. Just over 11 inches across the palm, not counting fingers. The stillness stayed with me while I worked down that fence line, rechecking every staple as if a flaw might return the world to normal. Birds finally started up around 8, first sparrows in the hawthorn, then magpies bickering near the trough, and the ordinary sounds of morning came back in pieces. But where those prints sat, the sense of being watched never arrived with menace. It felt more like being noticed. At the far end of the repaired stretch, I found one more thing, a short row of fist-sized creek stones laid along the base, where runoff always carved under after hard rain. 4 stones, then a gap for drainage, then 3 more. Exactly where I'd have put them if I had thought ahead yesterday. I hadn't. June stepped over them, sniffed the last one, and then trotted ahead toward home with her tail loose and easy. I stood there a while with drizzle beading on my jacket and the whole north pasture opening out grey and wide in front of me. I should have felt rattled. Part of me did. A bigger part felt an odd, steadying relief I didn't trust yet. Somebody or something had seen broken work and set it right, without asking credit, without leaving damage, without taking anything that wasn't already split or fallen. It didn't fit any story I knew how to tell, but it sat in front of me plain as wire and cedar. When I got back to the house, I hung my wet coat, washed mud from my hands, and opened the ledger to that morning's page. Next to north corner leaning. Repair after feed, I wrote. Repaired before daylight, better than my own. Large prints on top rail. June calm. I stared at that line for a long minute, then underlined only the last 2 words. June calm. On a farm, that counted as evidence. I closed the ledger, then opened it again, and read the line one more time to make sure I hadn't written myself into foolishness. Repaired before daylight. Better than my own. Large prints on top rail. June calm. My first instinct was to scratch through the middle part and replace it with something safer, maybe checked by neighbor, ask around. Instead, I shut the book and slid it back to the same corner of the mudroom table where it always sat. If I was going to keep my footing, I needed to tell the truth on paper, even when the truth came in odd shapes. Curiosity arrived as a practical thing before it became anything like wonder. I wasn't suddenly open-minded. I was suspicious in a way that felt almost energetic, and that was new. For months, every morning had felt like carrying wet feed sacks uphill. That day, I caught myself moving faster, running possibilities, planning checks. Grief stepped to the side for a minute and let my working brain through. I ate lunch at the counter, pulled on dry gloves, and loaded a rake, a coffee can full of flour, and an old shop rag into the truck bed like I was headed out to solve a machinery rattle. At the North Line, I made the kind of tests a stubborn man would trust. I raked a clean fan across the mud by the repaired brace, so any fresh track would show direction and depth. I dusted flour across the top rail where the handprints had been, light enough to hold detail, not so heavy it would clump in dew. At the loose gate chain near the side lane, I left one link half-seated so the wind would make it chatter. Then, I tied a strip of orange baler twine low on a cedar limb that overlooked the corner, mostly so I'd know if I was standing in the same place tomorrow, instead of convincing myself from memory. June watched all this with her patient old dog face, the look that said she had seen me do dumber things and had chosen not to intervene. I talked through the logic out loud because hearing myself helped me stay grounded. If somebody's messing with me, tracks will overlap. If it's one person, stride will repeat. If it's weather, flour's gone and that's that. June sneezed at the flour can and sat down in the rake marks, which ruined my clean fan and forced me to redo it. I told her she was a saboteur. She wagged like she'd won a prize. That night, the wind flattened and the temperature fell hard after sunset. By 9, the house had that brittle cold in the corners, even with the stove running steady. I should have slept. Instead, I lay listening to every loose thing outside. The chicken house tin, the porch swing chain, the branch tap at the eave, and waiting for the north gate chain to rattle in my head. It never came. Somewhere past midnight, I drifted off with the radio low and woke at 4:20 before the coffee finished brewing. By the third morning after that first repaired corner, frost sat clean and white across the lane, bright under the yard light. I drove north with the thermos between my knees and reached the test site, while the eastern ridge was still only a paler stripe under cloud. The chain at the gate didn't rattle when I touched it. Somebody had wrapped the slack section in my own shop rag, folded twice, and tucked through the links, so it damped the metal-on-metal knock without binding the latch. It was tidy, deliberate work, done by hands that understood noise carried in cold weather. My rake lines held a set of fresh prints as plain as if they'd been stamped in plaster. One track in, one track out, deep enough that the heel cups had crisp edges. No boot tread, no claw marks. The flour line on the rail showed a broad sweep where a palm had pressed down and pulled away, each finger ridge clear enough to count. June sniffed the print once, then trotted ahead to the next post, and looked back at me like she was asking why I was still surprised. 50 yards down, I found another repair I hadn't expected. A weak span where I'd patched with twine after the August windstorm had been rebuilt, with peeled cedar uprights and fresh woven wire tucked and pinned with a care that made my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't name. Beyond that, 2 feed sacks I'd left near the open skid by mistake were stacked under cover, off the ground on a pallet so they'd stay dry. Nothing was torn, nothing taken, just moved out of weather. I stood with one hand on the skid post and had to admit something I'd been fighting since that first morning. Whatever was doing this wasn't random and wasn't mean. A primary consideration on a farm is intent. Predators scatter things. Vandals damage things. Storms break things. This was the opposite. This was maintenance. At noon, I called Luke because silence had started feeling more dishonest than strange news. He picked up on the second ring over shop noise and an impact wrench whining somewhere behind him. "Hey, Dad, you all right?" "Yeah, yes, place is fine." "Okay," he said slowly. That's usually what you say right before something is not fine. I leaned against the feed room door and watched June asleep in a strip of sun. You remember that north corner I said was leaning? The one by the cedars? Mm-hmm. It got fixed. Then another stretch got fixed. Not by me. He waited a beat. You hire someone? No. And before you say coyotes with tool belts, I set tests. That got a short laugh from him. You what? Rake lines, flour on rails, gate chain left loose. And? And the tracks are one set, heavy and not boots. Chain got wrapped in cloth to keep it quiet. Feed sacks got moved under cover. June's calm around all of it. The wrench noise cut out on his end. You want me out there tonight? I thought about saying yes and turning this into something ordinary by sharing it. I also knew, in a way I couldn't defend, that this wasn't for a crowd. Saturday like we planned. Bring that fence stretcher if you can. I'm still checking all lines. You sound different, he said, voice softer now. Less pinned down. I looked out at the yard and the frosted pasture beyond it. Maybe I'm just busy. Busy is good, he said. Call me if it shifts. I will. I kept my word and called the co-op that afternoon too, asking if anybody had been out near my north boundary doing contract fence work. They checked the board, called back 40 minutes later, and said no crews were in my section all week. External explanation closed, at least on paper. 3 days passed in a pattern that should have worn off as novelty, and didn't. Dawn found one more weak point strengthened. Noon found cattle settled where they usually crowded and tested wire. Evening found me less likely to stand in the mudroom staring at Mara's old notes, like I was waiting for instructions from another life. The grief was still there, but curiosity kept opening a narrow lane through it, and I could walk that lane for a while without drowning in memory. On the fourth morning, the weather shifted again. The barometer had been dropping since supper, and by pre-dawn, the sky carried that heavy blue-grey that comes before real cold pushes in. I took the side-by-side instead of the truck, because the lower lane was slick, and June rode beside me with her chin on the dash, ears up. We reached the north tree line just as a thin band of light started behind the ridge. Not sunrise yet, more like the idea of sunrise. That was when I heard it. Cedar fibers groaning under weight. Then a dull set down. Then silence. Not crashing, not thrashing. Careful sounds spaced out, as if whoever moved out there had no interest in being hidden, and every interest in not breaking what didn't need breaking. I cut the engine. The quiet after the motor stopped was wide enough to feel. Breath smoked from June's nose. Somewhere to my left, a creek stone ticked under moving water. Then, between two old cedars at the edge of the pasture, a shape rose that did not belong to any animal I'd ever worked around and yet moved with a patience I recognized from good stockmen and old dogs. He stood near 9 feet if he was an inch, dark fur matted damp at the shoulders, long arms hanging easy at his sides. He had a split cedar post in one hand, lifted as casually as I'd carry a shovel. The scale of him should have knocked the sense out of me. Instead, what I noticed first was restraint. He stepped over a tangle of wire without snapping it, angled his body away from the herd so he didn't press them, and paused completely still when a doe and a late fawn slipped out of the brush and crossed the open strip between us. He let them pass. Not tense, not startled, just waiting. My legs forgot whose they were for a second. I stayed by the side-by-side door with one hand on the frame and felt my pulse in my throat. I told myself this couldn't be real, that grief and cold and too many lonely mornings were finally cashing in my sanity. Then June did something that settled the whole argument in one motion. She hopped down, trotted 10 yards into the pasture, sat, and wagged her tail at that enormous figure like she was greeting a familiar hand at feeding time. I heard my own voice before I approved it. Morning. It was the smallest, most ridiculous word I could have chosen for that moment, and I said it anyway. Somewhere Mara was probably laughing at me for good reason. He turned his head toward me then, slow and direct. The eyes were amber-brown, deep-set and calm, in a way that took fear out of the air before fear could root. No baring teeth, no charge, no warning display. He held my gaze 2 heartbeats, maybe 3, then dipped his chin once, almost like acknowledgement, and went back to work. He set the split post beside the brace, pressed one broad hand against the upper wire to hold tension, and used the other to seat the post into a hole that looked pre-dug and exact. Muscles shifted under wet fur with each controlled movement, but nothing in him read aggression. Everything read intention. He checked the line sight down the fence the way I did, adjusting by inches until the run was true. When he was satisfied, he packed soil at the base with the flat of his palm firm taps, then stepped back and looked over the corner. I could have moved toward him. I didn't. The distance he kept felt like part of the exchange, a boundary offered and respected both ways. I stayed where I was, breathing cold air that tasted like cedar and iron, and watched him finish what I had put off for weeks. When he turned to leave, he angled upslope instead of cutting across my path. At the edge of the cedars, he paused once more, looked back toward June first, then me, and touched the top rail with his fingertips, where the new brace met old wire. It was a small gesture, almost absent-minded, but it carried the same message as every repaired span and stacked sack. This matters, so handle it with care. Then he moved into the trees with a quiet that didn't fit his size, and the brush closed behind him without drama. I stayed there until the light fully broke over the ridge and the pasture changed from blue to winter gold. When I finally walked to the repaired corner, the handprints were fresh in damp soil at shoulder height above my reach, and the brace line was truer than any I'd set this season. June circled the post, sneezed, and leaned against my leg like she did when she wanted me to stop thinking and start moving. So I moved. I checked the herd, topped the north trough, and marked the new work in my notebook with a steadier hand than I'd had in months. Curiosity had started as a defense against grief, a way to occupy my head. That morning, it became something else, a framework big enough to hold both the facts in front of me and the parts of life I couldn't reduce to neat columns. I still believed in tools, measurements, and evidence. I had evidence now. It just came with a set of prints too large for any man I knew, and a calm pair of eyes at the tree line that had looked at me like I was worth helping. I stood with my notebook open against the truck hood and looked back toward the cedars where he had disappeared, then at the line of fresh work shining damp in the new light. And for the first time in a long while, I let 2 truths sit side by side without forcing either one out. I was a man who believed in weight, leverage, and measured distance. I was also a man who had just watched a huge, quiet being reset my fence with the care of somebody mending his own home. The tension between those facts didn't break me. It steadied me. I finished the rounds with a focus I hadn't felt since spring. At the lower trough, I chipped ice and topped water. At the carving shed, I tightened the latch Mara always said I left too loose. I even fixed that squealing hinge by noon, and while I worked, I caught myself smiling once at the thought that I'd joked about it, and then done it because I didn't want to look lazy in front of a creature who could outwork 3 men in sleet. I actually said, "Don't start judging my hinges too," to an empty doorway, and June wagged like that was a reasonable conversation to have. By that Thursday afternoon, cloud had thickened into a low lid over the ridgeline and the wind turned sharp from the northeast, carrying the metallic smell that comes ahead of hard ice. I kept hearing the co-op talk in my head about an early front, so I called County Extension from the mudroom phone and got a recorded advisory patched through to a tired-sounding man named Keller. He said it plain. Black freeze likely, 3-night event, sub-zero wind chill in open pasture, ice load on lines, creek rise possible where culverts are blocked. I wrote every word in the ledger margin. External warning, practical steps, no panic. When I hung up, I had the same feeling I got before carving storms. Do what you can while you still can. I loaded cedar stays, extra staples, and 2 bales of straw onto the flatbed and headed for the north and west lines where the wind hit first. June rode shotgun, nose at the cracked window. Pasture grass had gone brittle and pale, and the cottonwoods along the creek flashed dull silver undersides as the gusts rose. Around 3, I parked near the side lane gate where that chain had been wrapped, and I found one more sign that sat right on the border of ordinary and not. 6 peeled cedar poles, all cut to matching length, stacked beside the weak run I'd marked last week but hadn't reached yet. They were set parallel, ends squared, ready for braces. No drag marks from a vehicle, no boot tracks around them, just poles and prints, deep and singular, leading back toward timber. I should have been alarmed. Instead, I felt that now familiar lift in my chest, a small widening where grief had been packed tight for months. I set my own tools down, took one of the poles, and started in on the first brace. The ground was stiffer now, and every strike of the maul rang through my shoulders. Halfway through seating the post, June gave one soft huff and looked uphill. I followed her gaze. He stood 40 yards off at the tree line, not concealed, one hand resting on a trunk the size of a barrel, posture easy, eyes on the work. He could have stayed hidden if he wanted to. He didn't. That was the moment disbelief finally gave way to something quieter and stronger. Not surrender. Recognition. He wasn't stalking. He was checking in. I straightened up slowly and wiped my glove on my jeans, buying myself a second to keep my voice level. I'm doing the west run before dark, I said, feeling foolish and sincere at once. If that was your stack, thank you. He tilted his head a little, then stepped out from the cedars with the unhurried balance of something entirely at home on uneven ground. He stopped well short of me, maybe 30 yards now, and set down what he'd been carrying behind his leg. Another brace pole, thicker than the rest. He placed it carefully, not tossed, then stepped back again and waited. I took 2 steps toward the pole and stopped, making sure I wasn't crowding him. All right, I said. Shared project. I lifted it with both hands and nearly grunted at the weight. He watched, then looked toward the post hole and back to me, a small movement that read like instruction. I laughed under my breath. Yeah, I see it. For the next hour we worked the same stretch from opposite sides of the fence, close enough to track each other's rhythm, far enough to keep trust intact. I set staples and tensioned wire while he held top line steady with one broad hand, so it didn't twist. When I moved down 10 feet, he moved too. Never abrupt, never pressing in. Once I dropped my pliers and muttered at myself, and when I looked up, he had paused with his head turned, almost like he was giving me time to fetch them without feeling watched. Birds stayed in the hawthorn the whole time. A pair of does came through the far opening and kept grazing. Nothing in the field behaved like danger was present. The light went copper at the edge of evening. Wind carried cedar pitch, cold mud, and distant cattle breath. I found I could hold his gaze now without that jolt of panic from the first sighting. His eyes were the colour of creek water over brown stone, steady and direct but soft at the edges, and there was no fear in them of me either. That part mattered more than I expected. I had been moving through my own life like a noise to be endured, like a man too brittle for company. Standing there with hammer in hand and mud on my boots, I felt seen in a plain, workmanlike way that asked nothing except honesty. When the run was tight and true, I stepped back, breathed on my cold fingers, and nodded at the line. That'll hold, I think. He came forward just enough to press his palm against the top rail, testing tension. The rail dipped a fraction, then settled. He gave one short nod, turned, and walked uphill into the cedars. June trotted 3 paces after him, stopped, and returned to me without being called, tail loose. I watched until dark shapes and tree trunks became the same colour. Then I packed tools and headed home with the kind of tired that comes from useful work instead of carrying sorrow around. That night, Luke called while I was heating chili. I answered on the first ring, which startled him into a laugh. "Well, look at this," he said. "Who are you and what did you do with my dad?" "Your dad is still here, just got dirty today." "You hear the weather update?" "County Extension called it black freeze. Starts tomorrow night." "Shop's closing early. I can come first thing Saturday with chains and the big stretcher. Maybe before sunup if roads hold." I glanced through the mudroom window at the dark yard and June curled by the stove. "Saturday works. Come as early as you can. We'll set extra braces west side and check creek culverts." A pause, then, softer. "You okay, Dad? For real?" I held the phone tighter and chose the truest short answer I had. "I'm not okay all the way. I'm better than I was last week." "That counts," he said. "Get some sleep." After I hung up, I wrote his Saturday ETA in the ledger, weather permitting, then added one more line under it. West run reinforced, assistance observed, June calm. I looked at that word, assistance, and let it stand. By first light Friday, the cold had teeth. Frost crusted every gate chain, and the north wind came in flat and hard across the open ground. I ran feed early, then noticed Rosie wasn't with the main group by the upper hay ring. She was my best red heifer. Broad forehead, white sock on the left hind, and she always came in first when I rattled pellets. I counted twice. No Rosie. My gut dropped. I checked the draw side where she liked to bed, found fresh tracks veering toward the lower cedar break, and followed fast with June ahead of me. The ground there dipped toward the creek and caught wind in a bad cross-current. Halfway down, I saw where old wire from a long retired panel had surfaced from mud after last week's rain. One loop had snagged and twisted around brush. I swore at myself for not clearing it sooner and pushed harder downslope. Then I slowed to a stop at the edge of the trees. Rosie lay in a pocket of straw under a windbreak made from fir boughs and 2 angled saplings, built tight to the lee side of a fallen log, so the wind rolled over instead of through. Her breathing was steady. Her bad front hoof was free, no wire on it, and the skin above the pastern looked clean where mud had been wiped away. 10 feet off, near the wire tangle, he knelt on one knee with both hands working a twist of rusted strand apart so it lay flat and harmless in the dirt. Every movement was deliberate and controlled, strong enough to bend metal, careful enough not to startle a hurt animal. I didn't move for a few seconds. June did. She walked straight past me, circled Rosie once, then sat between us, calm as porchlight. Rosie lifted her head, saw me, and let out that low, uncertain moo she made when she wanted reassurance. I went to her slow, crouched, and put my hand on her neck. She was warm under the hide, a little shivery, but not panicked. "You're all right, girl," I whispered. My voice broke on the second word. "You're all right." Across from me, he finished flattening the last wire loop and pressed it into the mud with the heel of his palm. He rose to full height in one easy motion, then stepped back 2 paces to give me space with Rosie. The wind pushed sleet dust through the cedar trunks, but inside that little bough shelter it stayed almost still. I looked up at him with one hand still on Rosie and said the only thing that fit. "You took care of her." He held my gaze, then turned one open hand palm up toward the windbreak, as if to show what had been done, not to claim it. A simple presentation of facts. Calf sheltered, hazard removed, herd protected. Tears came before I could stop them. Not dramatic, just a hot spill in air cold enough to sting. For a year I had been braced against loss, against the next thing taken, the next call, the next empty chair. Kneeling there with my best heifer breathing steady under my hand and this immense, quiet neighbour standing back so I could reach her first, something in me unclenched. "I don't know how to repay that," I said, wiping my face with a dirty glove and giving up on dignity. "I don't even know what to call you." He made no sound beyond a soft breath that fogged in the cold. Then he inclined his head once toward Rosie, once toward me, and stepped around the far side of the log. He picked up a broken branch, set it over the last exposed wire end like a marker I couldn't miss later, then backed away toward the trees. I stayed with Rosie until she was ready to stand. When she got her feet under her, she leaned against my shoulder for balance, and I laughed through the leftover tears because she had always been dramatic when she knew she had an audience. June trotted ahead as we led her upslope, then looked back when she realized he wasn't following. He stood at the cedar edge, half in shadow, watching until Rosie cleared the rise and found the herd. Only then did he turn and disappear into timber. I went back down once more with fence pliers and cleared every scrap of old wire from that drawer. I rebuilt the windbreak where he'd set it, tighter this time, and added another bale of straw. In the ledger that evening, beneath feed counts and weather notes, I wrote, "Rosie found sheltered in lower cedar break. Windbreak built. Wire hazard removed. Assistance deliberate. June calm." Then I put the pencil down and rested my hand on the page until the shaking passed. I kept my hand on the page until the shaking passed. Then I shut the ledger and pressed both palms flat on the cover, like I was closing the lid on something more than numbers. The stove clicked and settled behind me. Wind rubbed a branch against the eave in slow, uneven strokes. June stood, stretched, and came over to press her shoulder against my knee, steady as a fence post. I bent and buried my face in the ruff at her neck, breathing in that dry dog smell and cold air she carried in from the mudroom door. What came up in me then wasn't one clean feeling. It was grief, yes, but also relief so sharp it almost hurt, and a kind of gratitude I had nowhere practical to put. I had spent a year bracing for subtraction. That day in the cedars, I had watched addition happen with my own eyes. By the time full dark settled over the yard, sleet had turned to a fine, hard snow that hissed across the porch boards. I set an extra log in the stove, filled 2 thermoses, and laid out the heavy gloves I used for barbed wire in bad weather. Routine still mattered. It gave my hands work while my mind ran circles. I tried to eat and managed half a bowl of chili. Then the phone rang, and this time I picked it up before the second ring. Luke said, "Road reports are getting ugly east of the river. I can still come in the morning, but I might need chains from mile marker 12 on." "Bring them," I said. "Wind's already building on the west run." He paused, then asked the question he'd been asking in different words for months. "How are you holding up tonight?" I looked at Mara's mug on the rack and decided I was done giving him the edited version. "I cried in the lower drawer today," I said. "Not a little. Full on, couldn't stop kind of crying. Rosie was hurt, and then she wasn't, because help showed up before I did. I don't know how to explain it better than that. He went quiet for a beat, but not the uncomfortable kind. You don't have to explain it neat. You're talking to me. That's enough. I sat down at the mudroom table and wrapped the phone cord around my fingers like I used to when I was nervous as a teenager. I'm sorry, Luke, for all those calls I let ring out. I know why you did, he said. Still hurt, though. I know. My throat tightened again. I kept thinking if I talked about her out loud, I'd fall apart and stay there. His voice softened. Maybe falling apart a little is how you stop staying there. I closed my eyes. Your mom would have said that exact thing. She did, he said, and I could hear him smiling through it. More than once. We stayed on the line another few minutes, mostly practical. Feed order, generator fuel, where we'd start if he made it by dawn. After we hung up, the house felt quieter, but not empty in the old, punishing way. More like a room after hard truth has been spoken and doesn't need repeating. Around 10:30, the first real gusts hit. The porch light flickered once, then again. I was in my boots and coat before the second flicker finished. June was at the door ahead of me, ears up, body alert, but not panicked. Outside, the cold had a hard metallic bite, and snow came sideways in thin white sheets. The herd had bunched tighter than usual along the lee of the calving pasture, which told me the wind had shifted harder than forecast. Then I heard it from the north edge of that pasture, a heavy crack, a drawn-out groan, and the flat thud of wood and wire taking weight all at once. Cottonwood. I grabbed the lantern from the hook by the barn door and ran the fence lane with June cutting ahead, my breath burning in my chest. The beam hit chaos at the creek bend, a big cottonwood limb down across the top line, 2 braces snapped, wire pulled into a bright tangled fan over the mud. Water in the creek had risen to the roots, black and fast with ice crust building at the edges. Rosie was there, caught at the edge of the tangle, flank heaving, one hind leg pinned where twisted wire and branch had locked together. She wasn't screaming, just making those low, frightened sounds that cut straight through bone. "Easy, girl, easy," I said, though my own voice shook. I set the lantern on a stump and moved in slow, hands out, trying not to spook her into fighting the wire. I reached for the nearest strand to ease tension and felt it hum tight as piano wire. No give, wrong angle. If I cut one blind in that mess, the recoil could whip her or me. My pliers were on my belt, but my fingers were clumsy in the cold and urgency. June stood off my left shoulder and gave one short bark toward the trees. Not alarm, more like announcement. He was there when I turned. Not sudden. Just present, 10 yards off in blowing snow, broad and dark against the pale fence line, posture low and open so he didn't crowd us. Lantern light caught damp fur along his shoulders and the calm set of his face. He looked at Rosie first, then at the wire, then at me. That order mattered. I swallowed hard and nodded once because language felt too small. She's pinned. He moved closer in 3 deliberate steps, and then lowered to one knee on the far side of the tangle, leaving me a clear line at Rosie's head. The scale of him beside that fence should have been overwhelming, but every motion carried restraint. One hand slid under the fallen limb and took just enough weight to ease the bite on the wire. With the other, he gripped a tensioned strand near the staple point, twisted, and snapped it clean with controlled force. No wild jerks, no thrashing, just precise pressure and release, one section at a time making a path where there hadn't been one. "Good, good," I murmured to Rosie, my hand on her neck, feeling her tremble ease in small increments as the pull came off her leg. Snow collected on my sleeves and melted from her breath against my glove. When the last tight strand dropped loose, he held the limb lifted and looked to me. I guided Rosie's shoulders clear, then her hips, talking nonsense comfort the way Mara used to with skittish calves. Rosie stumbled once, found her footing, and leaned hard into me. I laughed and cried at the same time, which is not a dignified sound for a grown man in a storm. He kept the limb raised until we were fully clear, then lowered it back into the break with care so the remaining fence didn't rip wider. The herd had shifted upslope but stayed contained, watching, ears forward. No stampede, no panic, just alert stillness in the sleet. I don't know what gave way in me right then, but it went all at once. Maybe it was the sight of impossible strength used so gently. Maybe it was Rosie warm and alive under my hand when 10 minutes earlier I had pictured losing her to cold water and wire. Maybe it was a year of swallowed words finally finding a crack. I put my forehead against Rosie's neck and wept plain and open into her winter coat, while snow stung my face and melted on my cheeks. I said Mara's name out loud for the first time in weeks. Then I said, "Thank you," to the night, to the animal beside me, to the being kneeling in the broken fence, to anything that had carried us to this exact minute. When I lifted my head, he was already working the breach. He set the heavier branch sections into a rough brace pattern against the snapped post, then pressed 2 rails into place with the heel of his hand, creating a temporary hold strong enough to keep the herd from testing through before morning. Practical, immediate, exactly what the moment required. I stepped in on my side, driving 2 staples with numb fingers where he held tension. We worked without speaking, passing attention back and forth by glance and movement, and in less than 10 minutes, the gap was no longer an open wound. Snow thickened, swirling in the lantern glow. The creek hissed below us. He stood to full height and looked down the line once, checking what we had set. Then he reached into the drift beside the post, lifted something smooth and pale from where runoff had dropped creek stones earlier in the season, and placed that stone square on top of the repaired cedar. Not decoration, marker, a quiet, unmistakable sign. This is the place that held. I put my hand over my chest to steady my breathing. "I won't forget," I said, and I meant more than the fence. He met my eyes one last time, and there was no drama in it, no demand to be understood, no performance of mystery, only calm regard, like a neighbor at a gate after hard work done right. Then he stepped back, giving me and Rosie the near side, turned toward the cedar break, and walked into the snow with that same unhurried balance. Within a few strides he was shadow between trunks. A few strides more and he was gone. No crack of branches, no final look over the shoulder, just absence returning to weather. I stood there listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods and the slow breathing of cattle settling again behind me. June came and leaned against my shin, warm and solid. Rosie nudged my elbow for pellets I didn't have, which made me laugh wetly and scratch her forehead. I took the lantern, checked the temporary brace twice, and led her upslope to the lee side where the herd had clustered. She folded into them like she had never been away. Back at the break, I touched the stone on top of the post. It was river smooth, grey, with one white band running through it, like a narrow winter sky, cold as iron in my palm, heavy for its size. I left it where he had set it, because some things are evidence, and some things are also promise, and that marker was both. By the time I reached the house again, my coat was crusted white, and my beard was stiff with ice. I stripped gloves, set the lantern down, and opened the ledger to the page where my hand had shaken earlier. Under the last line, I wrote in block letters so I couldn't pretend later that I'd exaggerated in the dark. Cottonwood down at Carving Bend. Rosie trapped, freed alive. Major breach stabilized during storm, Assistants present, deliberate, gentle. Stone marker placed on repaired post. Then I added one final note, smaller, almost to myself. Spoke Mara's name and stayed standing. June circled twice on her bed by the stove and lay down with a sigh that sounded like the end of an argument. I sat at the table until the shaking in my hands was gone for good, listening to the storm spend itself against the house. And for the first time since March, I did not feel abandoned inside my own life. I slept in my clothes and woke before the alarm to a house gone still in that particular way that meant the wind had dropped. The storm hadn't ended, but it had spent its worst anger. At 5:30, the yard light showed a world glazed white and hard, fences edged in ice, cedar branches bowed and glittering. June was already at the door, tail low and steady, ready to work. I poured coffee, filled a feed bucket with pellets for Rosie, and stepped out into air so sharp it made my teeth ache. By 6:15, headlights crawled up the lane in low gear. Luke's pickup came through the gate with chains clinking, windshield salted over, his shoulders hunched in that way men get after wrestling bad roads. He climbed out, took one look at my face, and didn't start with weather or equipment. "You look like you slept none," he said. "I slept enough." He glanced past me toward the north, then back. "That true?" I nodded. "Every word of it." He held my gaze another second, then reached into the truck bed and handed me the big fence stretcher. Then, let's go see what held. We started at the carving bend where the cottonwood had fallen. Dawn came up slow behind cloud while we walked the line, boots crunching crusted snow, our breath smoking in short bursts. The temporary brace was still in place exactly where we'd set it. The wire was tight enough to hold the herd. The stone sat on top of the post, grey with its white band bright against the frost. Luke stopped, set his gloves on the rail, and stared at the stone longer than he needed to for a simple fence marker. Then he crouched by the break and touched the snapped strand where it had been twisted off, clean. "No tool bite," he said quietly. "No." He stood and scanned the mud under the drifted edge where sleet had blown thin. One deep print had survived by the post, heel cup and toe spread still visible under a skin of ice. Luke looked at me with that same loaded expression from the porch weeks earlier, only this time he didn't leave the thought unfinished. "When I was 14, he said, Grandpa Hal took me up the East Ridge for elk sign. We found prints bigger than dinner plates near a spring. He told me don't mock what you haven't met. Said the old hills had neighbors we didn't own." He gave a small, almost embarrassed shrug. I figured it was one of his campfire lines. I felt something settle between us that had been tight a long time. He never told me that. "He said you were too practical to enjoy it." I laughed once, rough and real. He was right. We rebuilt the break proper before noon. Luke cut out the failed section while I set new brace posts. We swapped positions without talking much, the old rhythm returning in our hands before it returned in words. June moved between us like a foreman making rounds, occasionally sitting at the cedar edge and watching the tree line with relaxed ears. At one point, Luke held tension while I drove staples and said, "Mum would have liked this line." "Straight enough for her?" "Not quite," he said, smiling. "But she'd grade on a curve in this weather." By midday, we had 2 full spans replaced and an extra cross brace set against creek rise. At the side lane gate, we found the old shop rag still wrapped through the chain links, frozen stiff but intact. I took it down, folded it, and put it in my coat pocket instead of tossing it. Evidence or keepsake, I couldn't say yet. Maybe both. Back at the house, we thawed out over stew at the counter. I set the ledger between us and turned it so Luke could read the entries I'd made through the week. Repairs before dawn. Handprints on rail. Chain wrapped to quiet. Rosie sheltered. Assistance deliberate and gentle. Stone marker placed. He ran his finger down the lines, pausing at Spokemara's name, and stayed standing. He swallowed and nodded once. I'm glad you wrote it. You always trust what's written. I needed to see I hadn't dreamed it. He tapped the margin where I had noted Keller's warning. You call County back? Not yet. Do it while I'm here. So I did. I called Extension, asked for Keller, and got him after 2 transfers and 10 minutes of hold music. I gave him stock counts, line damage, creek status, and told him the west and north runs held through the second night because we pre-braced early. He said, "That probably saved you a lot of loss, Mr. Sutton," and logged my report for their storm file. Practical outcome. No legend required. After that, I called the co-op and confirmed no emergency crews had been dispatched to my section during the freeze. Same answer as before. None. When I hung up, Luke said, "You covered your bases." I needed all the ordinary answers checked before I kept the extraordinary one. That afternoon, we drove out one more time to clear the lower drawer. We pulled the last rusted panel wire from the mud where Rosie had snagged. Luke asked why there were fir boughs stacked wind-tight against the log, then stopped and answered himself. Right, that. Right, I said. We left the bough shelter in place anyway, reinforced and clean, because useful is useful no matter who started it. By Sunday evening, the worst of the black freeze had passed. Ice stayed in the shadows, but water lines ran, and the herd settled into normal feed noise instead of storm huddling. Luke stood by his truck at dusk, one hand on the door, and gave me that look again. Less worry now, more decision. I'm taking Wednesdays off, he said. Boss owes me comp time. I'll be out every week till spring branding. You don't have to do that. I know. I'm doing it. I nodded. All right, Wednesdays. He hugged me before he left, quick and hard, the way men do when they mean it more than they can say. I held on a second longer than I used to. By the second week of February, the snowpack had settled and the fence line stood clean under pale sun. I walked the north run with June and a thermos, checking each post with my glove, listening to meadowlarks testing early notes along the lower pasture. No new repairs appeared overnight. No fresh giant prints stamped the thawing mud. The help had come for the hard season and then gone quiet. I noted that in the ledger too. No further signs since freeze. Line stable. Mystery preserved. Facts respected. That same afternoon, I carried the stone from the carving bend to the porch rail. I did it in daylight, both hands around it, as deliberate as setting a cornerstone. I placed it above the steps where morning light hit first, white band facing out. June sniffed it, sneezed once, and lay down beside the door like she approved the location. In early March, Luke and I mended the last hinge Mara had circled in the old notebook, the one on the machine shed she always called the singer because it squealed a high note. We greased it, swung it, and heard only a soft click. There, Luke said, she'd be out of complaints now. Not a chance, I said. She'd find something. He laughed and leaned on the rail beside the stone. Dad, I need to tell you one thing plain. I believed you the first night you said you saw him. Why? Because you finally sounded like yourself. Sad, but yourself. That landed harder than any argument about tracks ever could. Grief hadn't left me. It had changed shape. It no longer ran the whole place. Spring came in honest increments, thawed ruts, then green haze on the willows, then calves kicking at flies in noon light. One evening in April, after feed and before dark, I sat on the porch step with June at my boots and called Luke just to ask about his day. No emergency, no agenda, just father and son talk about injector pumps and pasture rotation. When we hung up, I looked at the stone on the rail, at the north pasture beyond it, and said, "Thank you again," quietly, without needing an audience. I kept the ledger pages exactly as written. I kept the folded shop rag in the top drawer of the mudroom cabinet. I kept the measurements I'd made with fencing pliers in the notebook sleeve, even though I never submitted them anywhere and never needed anyone to validate them. I had checked every ordinary explanation available to me. I had logged the calls, the weather, the repairs, the outcomes. The prevailing facts stayed the same. A broken year, a brutal freeze, a farm that held, a heifer that lived, and kindness delivered by hands too large to be human and too careful to be feared. I wasn't cured of grief. That isn't how loss works. But I was restored to my life. I answered my son's calls. I ate sitting down. I said Mara's name without bracing for impact. I walked my own fence lines with purpose instead of dread. And when dawn lit the creek fog and frost stitched white along the wire, I no longer felt forgotten by the land. I felt accompanied in it, by memory, by family, and by the quiet knowledge that in my worst season, something ancient and gentle had met me at the break and helped me hold.